The sound of the vase hitting the hardwood floor was sharp, like a gunshot in the quiet house. Fragments of glass sprayed across the center of the living room, skittering into the dark corners. Mikah stood frozen, her hand instinctively coming up to shield her face. A jagged shard had sliced deep into the center of her palm. The blood welled up instantly, dark and thick, dripping onto the clean floorboards in a rhythmic, silent pattern. She did not flinch, though the sting was immediate and searing. The air in the room felt heavy, stagnant, and cold. Jessica stood just a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the mess she had created. Mikah looked down at the wound, watching the crimson bloom across her skin, but the physical pain was secondary to the weight of the moment. The silence that followed the crash was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The shattered remains of the vase lay between them, a jagged boundary on the floor. Every second that ticked by deepened the divide, the metallic scent of blood mingling with the stillness of the room. Mikah kept her hand steady, watching as the blood continued to pool, waiting for a reaction that she already knew would not come. Anderson did not look at the hand. His gaze drifted past the widening red pool on the floor, moving directly to the shards scattered near his feet. He stepped over the mess, his boots crushing a remaining piece of glass into dust. He stopped in front of Jessica, who had drawn back as if startled by the noise. He reached out, his movements fluid and practiced, and picked up a clean linen towel from the side table. He did not ask if anyone was hurt. He carefully held the towel out to Jessica, his expression shifting into one of practiced concern. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. He leaned in, blocking the space between the two women entirely, effectively erasing Mikah from the scene. He ignored the rhythmic pulse of blood from the wound, treating the injury as if it were a non-existent stain on the room's order. He focused solely on the person who had caused the destruction. Anderson finally turned his head, but his eyes did not soften. They tracked the trail of blood on the floor back to Mikah's palm, then settled on her face with a look of sharp impatience. He did not ask if she needed a bandage. He did not offer a word of sympathy. Instead, he let out a short, his voice cutting through the room with the force of a physical blow. "Look at this mess. You could have been more careful." The words hung in the air, stripped of any kindness. He shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment that had nothing to do with the broken glass and everything to do with her presence. Mikah stood motionless, her bleeding hand pressed against her side to stop the drip. She did not open her mouth to defend herself. The accusation was familiar, a well-worn path in their life together. She looked at the floor, then at the man standing between her and the exit, and finally at the person he was shielding. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as his words confirmed her total exclusion. She remained silent, letting the sound of his reproach settle over her like a shroud, completely alone in the center of the room. Mikah did not flinch at the accusation. She had heard the same condemnation 98 times before, each instance etched into the rhythm of their life. This was the 99th. The number sat in her mind, heavy and final. She looked at the blood on her palm, then up at Anderson, who was still shielding the person responsible for the destruction. The habit of arguing, of pleading for fairness, simply evaporated. There were no more words to offer, no more excuses to be made for his behavior. A strange, cold clarity washed over her. The room, which had seemed suffocating moments ago, now felt like a stage where the play had finally reached its conclusion. She watched him, but he was no longer the center of her world. He was merely an obstacle to be navigated. She took a slow, steady breath, her hand finally stopping its tremble. Her posture shifted, the tension in her shoulders unlocking as she let go of the need for his approval. She did not look for a towel or a bandage. She turned away from him, her movements precise and deliberate. She walked toward the kitchen, her steps silent and rhythmic, leaving the man and his chosen companion behind to face the consequences of their shared arrogance. The kitchen was cool, smelling faintly of lingering coffee and disuse. Mikah walked past the counter, her eyes fixed on the heavy silver serving tray resting near the sink. She reached out, her fingers curling around the cold, polished metal. It had weight, a solid, grounding presence in her palm. She lifted it, the metal catching the light as she turned back toward the living room. Each step she took was measured, deliberate, and entirely devoid of hesitation. The clatter of the tray against her hip was the only sound in the house, a rhythmic ticking clock that seemed to grow louder with every stride. Back in the living room, the atmosphere curdled. The air grew tight. She did not stop at the doorway. She kept moving, the tray held firmly in front of her like a barrier. The sudden shift in her energy was palpable. It was no longer the soft, yielding movement of a woman who expected to be ignored. She was a force moving through the space, and the change was unmistakable. Jessica saw her coming, her eyes widening as she tracked the path of the tray. A sharp, high-pitched gasp escaped her lips, and she retreated, her heels scraping against the floorboards as she scrambled to find space behind Anderson. The calm of the room shattered, replaced by the jagged edge of sudden, sharp-edged fear. Anderson did not wait for the confrontation to reach him. He saw the shift in trajectory, the way Mikah moved with a new, dangerous focus, and he reacted instantly. He lunged forward, closing the gap in 2 long, aggressive strides. His hands reached out, not to negotiate or to ask for calm, but to physically displace her. He shoved her aside with a harsh, jarring motion that sent her stumbling toward the edge of the room. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His features twisted as he positioned himself firmly between her and the woman cowering behind him. It was a total, violent rejection. He stood his ground, his chest heaving, his eyes locked onto hers with a look of absolute disdain. In that moment of physical contact, the invisible lines that had held their shared life together snapped. There was no room left for words, no space for apology, and no possibility of reconciliation. The rejection was complete, vibrating with his own perceived righteousness, unaware that he had just dismantled the foundation of his own world. Mikah regained her balance, her eyes cold as she stared at the man who had finally made his final, irrevocable mistake. Mikah stood still, her feet rooted to the floorboards as the echoes of his movement faded. She looked down at the silver tray in her hands. It felt heavy, yet entirely useless. She did not tighten her grip. Instead, she opened her fingers. The tray slipped from her hold, meeting the hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic ring that vibrated through the foundation of the house. It hit the ground with a force that seemed to jar the very walls. The sound was not a simple noise. It was an impact, a final, resonant clash that filled every corner of the room. It clattered once, twice, and then skidded into the shadows near the baseboard. The silence that rushed back in was different than before. It was heavy, hollow, and absolute. The house felt vacant, the air suddenly thin and devoid of the history they had built. Anderson remained standing where he had shoved her, his shoulders still hunched in defense, but the air had left his posture. He stared at the metal tray lying on the floor. Mikah did not look at him. She did not look at the woman hiding behind him. She simply watched the dust motes dancing in the light, her face a blank map of everything she had finally decided to leave behind. The house was quiet, and for the first time, she felt the space around her begin to clear. Mikah lowered her gaze to the floor, her breathing steady and rhythmic. A single tear escaped, tracking down the curve of her cheek before she caught it with her thumb. She did not tremble. The movement was practiced and precise, a final shedding of the history that had bound her to this space. She turned away from the discarded tray, her movements deliberate and devoid of hesitation. She reached into her pocket, her fingers finding the thick, textured paper that had been waiting there for days. She walked toward the dining table, the wood smooth and cold under her fingertips. With a slow, steady motion, she laid the heavy envelope flat against the polished surface. She slid it forward until it stopped in the center of the table. The white paper stood out against the dark wood like a scar. She did not linger. She pulled her hand back, leaving the document to speak for itself. The word divorce was printed in bold black ink, commanding the silence of the room. It sat there, heavy with the weight of years, turning the air in the house sharp and thin. She stepped back, her posture rigid, watching the paper as if it were a bomb waiting to be triggered. The finality of the ink was absolute, a clean break that could not be retracted, left to be discovered by the man standing only a few feet away. Anderson shifted his weight, his eyes catching the white rectangle on the table. He stepped forward, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He reached out, his fingers hovering momentarily before he snatched the envelope up. He tore the seal, the sound of ripping paper sharp in the quiet room. He pulled out the document, his gaze scanning the contents. When he saw the header, his brow furrowed, then cleared. He read the word divorce, and his lips curled into a tight, thin line. He looked up at Mikah, his expression shifting from surprise to a cold, jagged amusement. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed against the ceiling. It was a short, barking sound, devoid of humor, filled with a crushing sense of superiority. He tossed the papers back onto the table with a flick of his wrist. They skidded, catching the edge of the wood before settling. He shook his head, looking at Mikah with a pitying, condescending stare. He was entirely convinced that she was playing a game, testing his patience, and that she would be crawling back to him by sunset. He turned his back to her, dismissing the entire situation as a minor inconvenience, unaware that the foundation of his world was already beginning to fracture. Anderson did not wait for a response. He snatched his keys from the bowl by the door and signaled for Jessica to follow. He moved with a heavy, deliberate stride, his jaw set in a line of stubborn defiance. He wanted the world to see that he was unbothered, that his life remained untouched by the paper on the table. He drove them into the city center, his grip tight on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the storefronts for the most expensive displays. He parked in front of a high-end boutique, the glass front reflecting the bright afternoon sun. He led Jessica inside, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder as he pointed toward the display cases. He pulled his credit card from his wallet, holding it up like a weapon. He gestured at a display of diamond necklaces, his voice loud enough for the staff to hear, demanding the most expensive items in the store. He watched the clerk scramble, his pride swelling with every transaction. He threw money at the register, laughing as he watched the total climb. He was building a wall of gold, convinced that his wealth was an impenetrable fortress that would keep his world exactly as he wanted it to be. Day 2 began with the same relentless pace. Anderson marched through the jewelry district, his hands already weighed down by heavy shopping bags. He ignored the tired expression on the clerk's face and pointed toward a display of gold watches, his finger tapping the glass with impatient rhythm. He bought 3 in a single transaction, not because he needed them, but because the act of spending felt like a victory. He watched the digital receipts print, each one confirming his belief that he remained in control. By the 3rd day, his movements grew frantic. He entered a boutique and demanded the rarest pieces, his eyes gleaming with a manic need for validation. When a store manager hesitated to process a high-value request, Anderson barked an order, his face flushing with irritation at the brief delay. He didn't see the strange look the manager exchanged with a colleague. He only saw the prestige of the brand names he was collecting. He felt invincible, a titan of his own making, drowning out any lingering doubt with the clatter of diamonds and the swipe of his plastic. He sat in a velvet chair, smiling as Jessica draped herself in pearls, fully convinced that his wealth was an infinite resource that could buy his way out of any consequence. The 4th day did not bring the usual routine. The air in the city's center felt heavy, charged with a strange, static anticipation. Anderson woke up with the same hunger for status, but the streets were different. Pedestrians were not rushing to work. They were gathering in clusters, their heads tilted upward, high above the traffic. The massive dark screens mounted on the skyscrapers began to flicker. A low, rhythmic hum resonated through the pavement, vibrating beneath the soles of his shoes. Anderson walked into the plaza, a shopping bag swinging against his leg, but he stopped mid-stride. He looked up. Every screen across the city was shifting from its standard advertisements to a uniform, a mechanical heartbeat pulsing through the heart of the metropolis. People stopped talking. The ambient noise of the city died away, replaced by the sharp electric crackle of speakers being pushed to their limit. A banner began to scroll across the giant displays, something that demanded to be seen by everyone at once. Anderson felt a cold prickle of discomfort on the back of his neck, but he could not pull his eyes away from the encroaching, inevitable image about to consume the horizon. The white light on the screens snapped into focus, revealing the high-resolution logo of a global media network. A news anchor appeared in the center of every display, his voice booming over the city with a tone of rehearsed gravity. He began to speak, detailing the union of 2 of the world's most influential entities. The city plaza went unnaturally quiet as the news cut to footage of a private estate, the architecture sprawling and impossible to mistake for anything but extreme wealth. The anchor confirmed the date and the location, his words slicing through the air with absolute clarity. This was not a private ceremony. It was a global event scheduled for the coming weekend. As the anchor spoke, graphics flashed across the screens, displaying the growth of a new conglomerate formed by this merger. The sheer magnitude of the announcement turned heads in every direction. People who had been walking by stopped in their tracks, mouths slightly parted, realizing that the social hierarchy they understood was being rewritten in real time. The anchor's voice rose in excitement as he described the guest list, mentioning heads of state and international business moguls. The news was no longer just a headline. It was a seismic shift in influence. Anderson stood frozen beneath the towering displays, the weight of his shopping bags suddenly feeling like lead as the gravity of the announcement took hold. The news anchor stepped aside, and the screen surged with a new, crisp image. Mikah filled the frame. She stood on a sun-drenched balcony, the light catching the sharp lines of her profile. She moved with a measured, deliberate grace, her expression entirely unreadable to those who had once underestimated her. The silence in the plaza deepened. Spectators who had been whispering moments ago fell completely mute. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes steady, devoid of the hesitation or fear that had defined her previous life. There was no trace of the woman who had once stood in a living room, enduring insults while her own blood stained the floor. She commanded the space, a figure of calm authority against the backdrop of an architectural marvel. Every detail of her presence, the way she held her chin, the lack of nervous movement, the quiet confidence in her posture broadcasted a message of total liberation. Beside her, the blurred movement of an assistant adjusted a microphone, but Mikah did not blink or break her focus. She looked like a ruler surveying a kingdom she had claimed for herself. The public gaze was fixed on her, and for the first time, Anderson saw the ghost of the woman he had tried to break, now transformed into an untouchable force. The frame widened as a man stepped into view, moving with the practiced ease of someone who owned the air around him. The anchor did not leave the audience guessing. He spoke the name of the CEO of a global conglomerate, a man whose signature could move markets and topple industries. The impact was instantaneous. A collective murmur rippled through the city streets, a sound of genuine disbelief that turned into a roar of realization, a union that effectively erased the past months of public speculation. Every viewer understood the math. The woman who had been discarded was now tethered to the most powerful asset on the planet. The conglomerate logo hovered in the corner of the screen, a constant reminder of the resources now at her disposal. Mikah turned to look at him, and he leaned in, speaking something that made her smile, a genuine, sharp expression that lacked any hint of the old subservience. The camera zoomed in, capturing the two of them as a single, impenetrable unit. The broadcast cut to a montage of their recent acquisitions, proving that this was not just a wedding, but a strategic alignment of two empires. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been permanently dismantled. Anderson stood in the center of the boutique, his hands still hovering over a tray of gold-linked watches. He had been mid-sentence, ready to demand the finest item in the display, when the massive screens mounted above the mall entrance erupted with the news. The sound of his own laughter, directed at a joke he had made seconds earlier, died in his throat. He looked up. The feed showed Mikah, not the woman he had known, but a figure of absolute permanence, framed by the wealth and influence he had once thought were his alone to command. The world inside the boutique seemed to warp. The air grew thin. Anderson felt the weight of his own body shift, his knees locking as if his bones had turned to lead. He did not move. He could not. The watch slipped from his fingers, clattering against the glass counter with a hollow, final sound. His phone began to vibrate in his pocket, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that signaled the beginning of his social ruin, but he made no move to answer it. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, tracking the way the light reflected off the limousine window. The realization hit him, not as a thought, but as a physical blow to his chest, constricting his breath until the store became a cage. The luxury surrounding him, the very items he had used to define his superiority, suddenly looked like wreckage. The silence in the boutique held for only a heartbeat. Then, a voice cut through the air, sharp, loud, and unmistakably mocking. A woman standing near the entrance turned from the screen to the store, her finger pointing directly at Anderson. Recognition sparked across the room like a wildfire. Heads turned. Phones were raised. Lenses capturing the man who had been the face of a high-profile divorce just days prior, stripping away the anonymity he had relied upon. The whispers started as a low hum, then sharpened into distinct, biting comments that echoed off the polished marble floors. A group of teenagers laughed, nearly tripping. The store manager, who had been bowing to Anderson moments ago, stood rigid behind the counter, his expression replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. He did not offer help. He did not offer a seat. He simply watched, his arms crossed, as the public circled. Anderson was no longer a customer. He was the center of a public trial, and the verdict was already being read by every stranger in the room. The whispers coalesced into a singular, rhythmic taunt that seemed to vibrate through the mall floor. Anderson stood paralyzed, his ears ringing with the same phrase repeated from every corner of the corridor. He traded a diamond for a piece of glass. The words were not just insults, they were a verdict. A passerby leaned in, meeting Anderson's hollow gaze with a cruel, knowing smile, and repeated the line directly into his face. The sting was immediate and searing. It was the simplicity of the judgment that shattered his remaining composure. He opened his mouth, his throat tight, attempting to shout over the noise, to demand silence, but his voice cracked and died in the stale air of the boutique. The crowd did not care for his explanation. They only cared for the irony. He looked around for an exit, but the store manager had blocked the path, his gaze fixed on a ledger as if Anderson were invisible. Every laugh felt like a physical strike. The air in the mall grew heavy with the weight of his own foolishness. He had spent his life valuing the wrong things, and now, the entire city was queuing up to remind him of the price. The phrase followed him like a shadow, echoed by strangers, etched into the very walls of the hallway, turning his past decisions into a permanent public joke. The vibration began as a low, persistent buzz against his hip, growing in intensity until it felt like a trapped insect. Anderson pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. Desperate for one message of solidarity, he swiped the display. The screen flooded with notifications. Not one was an offer of help. Every alert was a screenshot of the wedding broadcast, captioned with laughing emojis and biting sarcasm. Friends he had dined with, partners he had funded, and acquaintances he had ignored were now all contributors to the digital assault. One by one, the messages piled up, burying his inbox under a mountain of mockery. He tried to scroll, but the speed of incoming pings made the device stutter. The screen glowed, illuminating his face with the harsh, cold light of public ridicule. He watched as his closest associates tagged him in public threads, their words as sharp as glass shards. There was no escape. The phone felt heavy, a burning weight in his palm. He looked up, searching for a sympathetic face in the store, but the boutique was empty of allies. The digital world had aligned with the crowd outside, closing the circle around him. His thumb froze. He realized then that he was not just losing his social standing, he was being erased by the very people he had once called peers. Jessica did not notice the change in the atmosphere. She was focused entirely on the counter, her eyes fixed on the display of diamond necklaces. She pulled the gold-plated card from her wallet and slid it into the reader with a practiced, arrogant motion. The machine emitted a long, flat, dissonant tone. The screen flashed red. Transaction declined. She frowned, pulled the card out, and wiped it against her palm. Convinced it was a surface error, she shoved it back into the slot. Again, the machine shrieked. The red light pulsed, casting a harsh glow on the glass counter. Jessica tapped her fingers against the wood, her movements frantic, her breath hitching as she tried a third time. The machine did not even register the chip. It remained dark, unresponsive, as if the account behind it had ceased to exist. The silence in the boutique became absolute. The clerk behind the counter stopped moving, his hand hovering over the receipt printer, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to cold, sharp suspicion. Anderson stood a few paces back, his phone still buzzing in his hand, his eyes darting from the terminal to the clerk. The air grew thin. The store was no longer a place of luxury. It was a trap. Jessica turned to look at him, her face drained of color, her mouth hanging open as the realization of the empty credit line finally broke through her denial. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The terminal sat on the counter like a tombstone, its screen dark and final. Jessica kept tapping the screen, her nails clicking against the plastic, but no light flickered in response. Then, the sound of measured footsteps cut through the quiet. From the back office, the store manager emerged. He did not look at the jewelry. He did not look at Jessica. His eyes were fixed on Anderson. In his hands, he carried a heavy bound stack of bank statements, the paper edges sharp and crisp. He walked with a deliberate, slow pace that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. With a heavy thud, he dropped the documents onto the glass counter. The sound echoed, a final, definitive note that signaled the end of the charade. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket and laid it across the top of the pile. The manager did not speak, but the look he gave Anderson was heavy with judgment. The weight of the papers seemed to press down on the counter, bowing the glass slightly. Anderson stared at the top page, his pulse thumping in his throat. The evidence was there, a mountain of paper documenting the end of everything he had built. The reality of his ruin was no longer a suspicion. It was a physical weight sitting right in front of him. The manager flipped the first page with a sharp, crisp sound. He pointed a finger at a series of highlighted figures, each one a massive transfer of funds. Anderson leaned in, his eyes scanning the dates and the account numbers. These were not random errors. They were months of calculated, systematic drains. Every transfer was routed to an offshore account registered in Jessica's name. Anderson traced the lines of ink with a trembling hand, the numbers blurring into a single, damning total. He looked up at Jessica. She had stopped moving. Her hands were pressed against the counter, her knuckles white, her gaze darting toward the exit. She did not defend herself. She did not deny the figures. She simply braced herself against the glass as the truth settled over the room like dust. Anderson tried to speak, but his throat constricted. The man who had spent months showering her with luxury, who had prioritized her whims over everything else, stared at the woman who had been hollowed out his future from the inside. He looked back at the statements, then at her. The betrayal was not just in the money. It was in the sheer scale of the deception. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely, utterly speechless, watching his life dissolve into rows of printed numbers. Anderson grabbed the papers, his fingers tearing the edges as he flipped to the final summary page. There, in bold print, the total read 0. He blinked, expecting the numbers to shift, but the ink remained static, mocking him with its finality. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the banking app. He logged in, his heart hammering against his ribs. The screen loaded, then displayed the same void. No credit, no savings, no hidden reserves. The accounts were empty. He dropped the phone onto the floor, the glass casing cracking against the polished tile. The sound was sharp, brittle, and pathetic. He looked around the store, at the displays of expensive watches and gold chains he had intended to buy, now completely out of reach. The pride that had fueled his ego for months evaporated in an instant, leaving him exposed. He stood in the center of the boutique, surrounded by luxury he no longer possessed. His shoulders slumped, his chest hollowed out by the sheer weight of his bankruptcy. The reality was absolute. He had lost his money, his influence, and his sense of self. He was a man holding nothing but a stack of worthless paper, staring at the ruins of a life built on a lie. Jessica did not wait for the manager to finish his explanation. Her eyes darted toward the exit, scanning for an opening as the weight of the accusation settled in the room. She shoved a display of watches, sending them clattering across the floor, and lunged toward the door. 2 security guards stepped forward, blocking her path before she could reach the handle. She stopped, her breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The composure she had cultivated for months vanished, replaced by a twitching, frantic energy. She pressed her back against a glass cabinet, her fingernails digging into the wood. She looked at Anderson, but the gaze was no longer soft or pleading. It was sharp, calculating, and terrified. She began to claw at her own neck, her chest heaving as she realized there was no exit left, jagged sound that was neither a plea nor a scream. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she tried to pull her phone from her pocket, but she dropped it twice. She was a cornered animal, stripped of every pretense, staring at the locked doors and the faces of the people who now saw her for exactly what she was. Anderson stood paralyzed. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to amplify, filling the silence where his authority used to be. He looked at the bank statements in the manager's hand, then at the empty screens, and finally at his own reflection in the store mirror. He looked older. The confidence that had defined him for months had vanished, leaving only a hollow shell. He reached out to grab the counter for support, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His mouth open to demand an explanation, to shout, to exert some form of control, but no sound came out. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had been the architect of his own destruction. Every choice he made, every insult he leveled at the person who had actually cared for him, now returned as a crushing weight. He watched the store manager signal for more security and felt a cold numbness spread through his limbs. He was not just broke. He was exposed as a man who had discarded a diamond for a piece of glass. The laughter from the mall outside drifted through the glass doors, a sharp reminder that the world was watching his total undoing. He did not move. He could not. The pride that once kept his head high had finally snapped, leaving him anchored in the wreckage of his own monumental stupidity. The manager did not look at him with pity, only with the cold efficiency of a man clearing out trash. He pointed toward the glass entrance. Anderson shifted, his boots heavy on the polished floor, dragging his feet as if the ground itself were resisting his departure. He passed the displays of jewelry he had purchased just yesterday, now nothing more than reminders of a debt he could never repay. As he reached the threshold, a guard gently but firmly placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him out. The transition from the climate-controlled luxury to the harsh, unfiltered light of the mall corridor felt like a physical shock. He stumbled, catching himself against a cold metal railing. Around him, the bustling crowd parted, eyes darting away as if his disgrace were contagious. He looked at his hands, empty and trembling. The phone in his pocket buzzed again, but he lacked the strength to retrieve it. He stood on the edge of the polished tiles, looking out at the city that had stopped caring about his name. There was no one left to call, no credit to sustain him. He was a man stripped of every pretense, standing in the center of the world he had once commanded, now reduced to a ghost in his own life. The air carried only the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Mikah sat on a wooden bench, her hands resting flat against the cool, weathered slats. The garden was a pocket of absolute silence, tucked far away from the reach of her former life. She watched the light shift through the leaves, casting long, steady patterns across the grass. There was no urgency in the way the wind moved, no sudden interruptions to break the calm. She took a slow, deep breath, feeling the tension that had lived in her shoulders for years finally unravel. Every movement she made now had a deliberate, unhurried grace. The frantic pace of the past had been replaced by the rhythm of the seasons. She watched a sparrow land on the path, peck at a pebble, and take flight again, undistracted by the world beyond the hedges. Her gaze settled on the horizon, where the sky transitioned from pale gold to a soft, deepening violet. The wreckage of her previous years felt like a distant memory, a story belonging to someone else. She was no longer waiting for the next blow or bracing for a shout. She was simply present, breathing in the quiet, and for the first time, she was entirely at peace. A soft sound broke the garden's stillness. Mikah shifted her arms, adjusting the weight of the infant cradled against her chest. She felt the rhythmic, steady rise and fall of the child's breathing, a pulse of new life that anchored her to the present. The baby's small hand curled tightly around her thumb, a grip that demanded nothing but presence. Moments later, the crunch of gravel signaled Brad's approach. He moved with a quiet, measured pace, holding the second child with the same careful focus. He sat beside her, allowing their shoulders to touch. The garden felt fuller now, resonant with the soft, indistinct murmurs of the twins. Mikah looked down at the faces nestled against them, features that represented a clean slate, untarnished by the bitterness of her former existence. Brad reached out, his hand resting gently over hers, connecting their touch to the children they held. There was no need for words in this space. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the reality of what they had built together. She watched the way the light caught the fine, pale hair of the infants. Each movement was deliberate, each breath a testament to the life she had reclaimed. They were a singular unit, defined not by what they had lost, but by the tangible, breathing future they held in their arms. The sun began its final descent, painting the horizon in layers of burning amber and deep bruised plum. Mikah watched the light retreat from the garden floor, the shadows stretching long and thin toward the gate. The world outside these walls felt like a different continent, a place of dust and broken glass that no longer had a claim on her. Beside her, Brad adjusted his grip on the infant, his eyes fixed on the same vanishing point where the sky met the earth. The air temperature dropped, bringing a crispness that signaled the end of the day, yet the warmth of the children remained constant against their chests. They sat in perfect stillness. The horizon swallowed the last sliver of the sun, and the vibrant colors faded into the steady, predictable gray of twilight. There was no looking back. The wreckage of her former existence had been left in the wake of this new reality, lost to the distance. She felt the weight of the child in her arms, a solid, breathing anchor that kept her firmly in this moment. The transition was complete. As the first stars pricked through the darkening canopy above, she shifted her gaze away from the horizon, satisfied with the quiet. The day was done, and the life she had once endured was nothing more than a shadow dissolving into the night. The city pulse moved at a frantic pace around him, a river of commuters and traffic that never slowed. Anderson stood on the edge of the sidewalk, his boots scuffed and his posture hunched against the evening chill. He stopped, his gaze drawn upward by a sudden, brilliant flicker of light. Above the intersection, the giant display screen cast a harsh, artificial glow across his face. It was a replay of the broadcast Mikah standing by the limousine, her expression calm, her future clear. The crowd surged past him, shoulders brushing his arms, but nobody looked his way. He reached out to steady himself against a cold metal lamppost, watching as the image on the screen shifted to a shot of her garden, a world of peace he could no longer touch. The sound of the city sirens, engines, and the overlapping chatter of strangers drowned out his own ragged breathing. He was a ghost in his own neighborhood. A group of people walked by, their laughter echoing against the glass buildings, entirely unaware of the man standing in their path. Anderson watched the screen go black, then turn to a commercial. He remained there, rooted to the concrete, as the rest of the world continued its forward motion, leaving him behind in the deepening shadows of the street.